Where would we be without the grace of God? You know, early in January, Carl Jansen came up to me after noon Mass, and he said, "You know, Father David, nobody teaches on the 10 Commandments anymore." And I said, "Well, you know what, Carl? The next time that comes up in the readings, I will teach on it." He said, "Thanks. I'm going to be looking forward to that message." Now, Doug was there when this happened, and so was Mark Ward, so they're my witnesses. I went into my office, and I began looking at the readings for today, and guess what they were all about? The commandments, the laws. And I was like, well, Carl, I guess you were used by God to kind of steer me in the direction I was supposed to go with the readings today, because we see it all through. Sirach talks about the commandments, Paul talks about the commandments, and then Jesus expands on the commandments. And we're going to look at this from a couple of different ways, but we're going to start with Sirach, because the first thing we note is that choosing to keep the 10 Commandments is essential to doing the will of God. And I just want to repeat that, because this is important, and we do have kids here, and this is important. Okay, choosing to do the 10 Commandments and to keep them is essential for doing the will of God. Sirach says, if you choose, you can keep the commandments. Loyalty is doing the will of God. But then he goes even further, and he kind of equates the doing or not doing of God's commands to life and death. He says, before everyone are life and death. Whichever they choose will be given them. Now, why is this so important? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's Super Bowl weekend. That's why. And no, this is so related, right? Imagine playing football without any rules. Can you imagine that? If the teams just got on the field and they started doing whatever they wanted? I mean, imagine the chaos. The players, the coaches, the referees, they all need common rules to go by so they can know how to move the ball, what constitutes a foul, how to award points, how much points those points are worth, or the touchdowns, the field goals. All this is so important. And I think we can relate to that because we live in a cause and effect world, right? I mean, we all know what happens when we violate the commands of God. And before anybody gets judgy, we all do it, okay? And so we know what happens, right? If we bear false witness, or if we steal, or if we commit murder, or if we commit adultery, we make messes. That's what happens. That's why I started this by saying, thank the Lord for the grace of God. Thank the Lord for the grace of God. You know, the thing about the 10 Commandments, one of the features is, it not only gives us structure and order, because we have to remember these were given to Israel when they were forming a new nation, right? To guide them, to help them. But they weren't just given to give structure and order. They were given to guide us in our relationships. And we see the cross is kind of set up, or the commandments are set up like a cross. That is, we have 3 vertical commandments that guide us in our relationship with God. And then we have 7 commandments that guide us in our relationships with one another. So look at the 3 that guide us in our relationship with God. I got those highlighted in yellow. It says, I am the Lord your God. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. Now we have the 7 that are related to each other. Honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. Now all these are designed to keep us in bounds with God and with each other. And if we think about this in our culture, and we were to ask ourselves, well, which one of these do we violate the most in our culture? I would have to say that in our culture today, we're probably most guilty of violating number 3. Remember to keep holy this Sabbath day. And as I was reading through these, I looked at that word holy in the original Hebrew because I wanted to know more about what this word holy means. And the Hebrew word for holy is kadesh. And what that word means is set apart or consecrated. So our Sabbath day is something that is supposed to be set apart and consecrated for God's use. Just like our chalice and our paten is consecrated and set apart for God's use on the table. We don't just take it out and use it to drink water or Pepsi or whatever. It has a very holy, set apart, consecrated purpose. That's what we're supposed to have once a week, dedicated and set apart to God. And so, the thing is, though, it's kind of easy to take the things God says are supposed to be set apart and just kind of push them aside and forget about what God says is going to lead to wholeness and lead to balance, and then instead just kind of go with the flow of whatever culture we live in. Right? This is easy to do, to just kind of go with the flow. And I think this is what Paul was pointing out in his letter to the Romans. Paul says this, he says, "Brothers and sisters, we speak a wisdom to those who are mature, not a wisdom of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away. Rather, we speak God's wisdom." And what Paul is saying is that if we're going to choose between wisdoms and teachings, let's go to the ancient, revealed, inspired wisdom of God. Because it's set up to guide us into really good relationships with one another and God. And sometimes when we're just going with the flow of society or the leaders of our age or secular philosophy, that flow leads into some bad areas, some unloving areas, when we start replacing God's wisdom with our own collective wisdom. Now, this is an extreme of that. This picture here is a picture of Auschwitz. That's a concentration camp. And according to Adolf Eichmann, a senior SS official, over 6 million Jews were killed during World War II. Now that is the extreme of what it looks like to set God's guidance aside and just go with the flow. And I don't think we want to do that. I mean, look what's going on in Russia right now as the people are following the wisdom of the age of the rulers. They're guiding them into all kinds of war. And it's a tragedy what's happening. So while we might be pressured to go with the flow, these commands that God gives us are really a better structure to draw us into God's love for one another and to God. And I want to lighten the mood a little bit because I know that's pretty heavy. We're going to bring this back and put it in the Super Bowl terms, right? Super Bowl weekend, right? We don't want to just, we don't want to leave that out because that's part of what's going on right now. And just imagine if one team was to show up to the Super Bowl playing by their own rules, right? How many people here, when you played games as a kid, you kind of made up your own rules for the yard, for the field, and you played by those, right? And we all have our own rules, but imagine one team comes to the Super Bowl and they've got all their own rules that they're going to play by. Well, that's going to be fine and dandy for them, but I guarantee you the referee is going to be calling the fouls and awarding the points according to the established rules of the game. And this makes me think about how God is our referee in heaven. And how really, if we want a successful life, we should play by His rules. We should play by the established guidelines He gives us. And that's not just about rules, okay? Remember, it's about relationships, right? So interesting enough, we see in our gospel reading today that Jesus had a lot to say about the 10 Commandments and how we should strive to implement them. And what I love is Jesus is really helping the people to see the loving foundation of the kingdom ethic that is beneath the laws, because they are about God's love and about God's mercy and how we can better get along and our communities can thrive. That's what it's about. They're not supposed to be used to judge each other and say, well, it says right here you're not supposed to do that and you did it, what's going on there. No, it's not supposed to be like that. We're supposed to use these ordinances and commands to strengthen and build our relationships. And Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill. And whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment.'" See, the point that God wants us to get at is it's in the heart. The love we need to have for one another. It's in the heart. And Jesus goes on to say, before we even think about coming to the altar with our gift, before we even think about addressing the vertical relationship with God that's kind of invisible and based on faith, we need to take care of those horizontal relationships that are here now, that we can see, that we're interacting with, based in material world. So we need to stop and think sometimes, am I loving my brother? Am I loving my sister? Those are the two great laws, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. And the second one is like unto it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. So what do? Well, we take a little assessment. We look around and we say, who in my life do I really need to show the love that's undergirding these commands, the love that Jesus implemented and that he showed forth to people? And what do I need to do to make these relationships really thrive and successful? And then once we do that and take care of that, then we come to the altar and we give our gifts to God. That's what I think we're supposed to take away from the 10 Commandments today.